My name is Juan Francisco Cristobal, Juan Shunik Palas in Anjoal. I am from Guatemala and I am of Mayak Anjoal descent. I would like to thank the Chicano Research Center for inviting me and my group to be part of this event to celebrate the Day of the Dead, to remember each of our ancestors, where we come from, and our roots. I am a PhD candidate in ethnomusicology at UCLA, and my research focuses specifically on this point on remembering the ancestors, the Day of the Dead, and why we celebrate this unique and very special day. In traditional cultures, especially among indigenous people, we don't celebrate this on this specific day, but we do recognize our ancestors each and every day by calling on them. My research focuses on the traditional music of the Mayak Anjoal people, especially the specific instrument, the violin, and how it remains a main instrument within part of their culture, but as well as those in the diaspora in the United States. I focus on how memory and music play a role, especially in the United States and among the diaspora, and how they remember their homeland and how they recognize and give homage to their ancestors. And thank you so much again to the Chicano Studies Research Center for this invitation, and I hope you guys enjoy this performance and as we honor our ancestors through music. Thank you. So this is a collective of Anjoal musicians in South LA. The group focuses on traditional Anjoal music practices and aim to revitalize ancestral music and to create new music based on traditional styles. We're going to do a short invocation based on traditional instruments that we have. I'll be invoking the ancestors through playing the conch shell, and I will have our member playing the drum. First off, before I continue, we have Virus Garcia, who will be playing the guitar, Simon Garcia, who will be playing the drum, also accompanying us with the bass guitar, and I will be playing the violin.
kual yechnal aiteje justa repjana aisha to bayun shayi banginal y ashketun kualti kual yet chapunzan zetal shwani kana koma wishma mashka speed aton hunzan habetun bejanilti achabe yetos kuskulele tos salkulal yo aisha to bayun shayi banginal yutul ahun qinale hunix qinaleti tok as mahan lai yet chon kami mayet ay kamich to stop ay huk shaib ang inal kay to yelab no hung kualti y kay to yelab no kawas ay mam ismam ay hunsan pit ko tena yet hum behanilti at hunsan to chab la yet pai shatu yag alaga chab la nani yet ay marshal kami irto la hunsan pitu chab la tagal bay hun shaib ang inal kal bay hun hiban inal bay iksanduti bailan nan to hekon ko karati. Adios.
Hello, my name is Alonso. I'm a history undergraduate student at UCLA. I was born and raised in East LA, and I'm going to be sharing the UCLA Land Acknowledgement. The UCLA Chicano Studies Research Center acknowledges our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples.
Welcome to Love and Loss during the COVID-19 pandemic, an event organized by the UCLA Chicano Studies Research Center in collaboration with the Department of Chicana, Chicano, and Central American Studies, along with the Latino Policy and Politics Initiative at the Luskin School of Public Affairs. I'm Veronica Tedez, the director of the Chicano Studies Research Center. The Chicano Studies Research Center is an organized unit that bridges different sectors of UCLA's campus and the community. Through collective efforts, the center seeks to advance research, programming, and mentoring focused on diverse Latinx communities. Dia de los Muertos is a spiritual and sacred celebration that takes on a variety of names and forms across the Americas. It has its roots in multiple indigenous cultures. Dia de los Muertos is intended to honor the lives of the loved ones we have lost. This year, the celebration takes on a different meaning during this current pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic has caused so much loss and devastation across the world. Here in the United States, the world's largest economy, we have had more deaths than any other nation. The effects of this pandemic have been felt unequally. Latinx communities and other communities of color have endured disproportionate negative impacts in terms of infections, deaths, and associated economic and emotional hardships. In reflecting on the current pandemic, I can't help to think about how the legacy of colonialism of the Americas and how smallpox and other diseases contributed to the genocide of indigenous people across both continents. During today's event, we want to think about how pandemics and health disparities have historically and currently lead to the premature death of people impacted by other social injustices. At the same time, I want us to remember, celebrate, and honor the memory of our ancestors, including those that lost their lives during the current pandemic. This loss is very personal to me. Earlier this year, my tia, Marta Tedez, lost her life to COVID-19. She was my dad's sister and the wife of my mom's brother, so both sides of my family experienced her loss. My tia had a beautiful smile and a wicked sense of humor. She was a loving mother of 6 and a doting grandmother of 15 beautiful grandchildren. She, like so many who lost their life to the virus, had underlying health conditions. She suffered from diabetes, a disease that disproportionately impacts Latinx individuals who, like my tia, grew up in poverty and resided in an environmentally toxic community. My tia lived in La Puente, not far from the city of industry that is responsible for emitting dangerous pollutants into surrounding predominantly Mexican-American neighborhoods. The pandemic exacerbated health disparities in communities that were already marginalized because of their racial background, their immigrant background, their income background. I want to acknowledge that the victims of the pandemic are not just the individuals who lost their lives directly due to the virus. The victims include those who were infected and survived, but faced health setbacks in the short term and in the long term. Sadly, some will not make it. The victims will include people like my sweet, loving, and headstrong Tio Eugenio. Eugenio Tedez Enciso was infected by COVID-19 a year ago. It seemed like a miracle when he survived after being hospitalized for 4 days. But sadly, he died a month ago because of health complications aggravated by the virus. Sadly, My family's experience is shared by many of you who lost grandparents, parents, aunts and uncles, siblings, and cousins. Some of you even lost children. And others of you lost chosen family members, good friends, and mentors. Many of us have not had the time to properly mourn all these losses. Today is about remembering and honoring those who have now become our ancestors and recognizing their many contributions. But it's also about acknowledging and fighting the injustices that contributed to unequal suffering in the Latinx community, in African American, Native, and Pacific Islander communities. To remind us of the impact of COVID-19 on Latinx and other racialized groups here in California, I now turn to Arturo Bustamante, Professor of Public Health and Faculty Affiliate of the Chicano Studies Research Center. Professor Bustamante is also one of the leaders of the UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Initiative.
Good day, everyone. My name is Arturo Vargas Bustamante, and I am a professor of health policy and management at UCLA and a faculty research director at the UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Initiative. I am also a faculty associate of the Chicano Studies Research Center. I want to welcome you all to this event. This Day of the Dead is an important date for us to reflect and honor those who have died from COVID-19. While the worst of the COVID-19 pandemic seems to have passed, the virus seems likely that it will become endemic and it will continue to play a toll on the health and well-being of our community. In my presentation today, I want to provide an overview of the consequences that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on Latinos in California and on the rest of the country. I will be using different measures such as the number of cases, mortality, and hospitalization from COVID-19. First, it is important to acknowledge that until early October, we had approximately 4.5 million registered cases and approximately 68,800 deaths from COVID-19 in the state. From a health equity perspective, it is important to be mindful that the COVID-19 pandemic has disproportionately affected the health and well-being of race and ethnic minority populations. This slide is showing the share of COVID-19 infections in California stratified by race and ethnicity. Here, we want to compare these shares of infection with the proportion of each race and ethnic group in California to visually identify how the pandemic has affected each race and ethnic group based on the population representation. As shown here, Latinos in California have been overrepresented in COVID-19 infections relative to their share of the state's population. While Latinos represent 41% of California's population, a total of 70% of recorded COVID-19 infections were reported among Latinos. By contrast, the non-Latino white population that represents 39% of California's population reported 19% of recorded infections in the state. Likewise, approximately 6% of recorded infections were among Asians, while Asians represent 15% of California's population. In the case of the Black population in the state, a total of 5% of recorded infections were reported among Blacks, which resembles the share of the Black population in California. When we look at mortality due to COVID-19, we observe similar trends. This slide shows the proportion of COVID-19 deaths in California stratified by race and ethnicity. This slide is similar to the previous slide, but here the variable of interest is COVID-19 deaths. And as in the previous slide, Latinos in California continue to be disproportionately affected by mortality due to COVID-19. While Latinos represent 41% of California's population, approximately 50% of recorded deaths due to COVID-19 in the state were among Latinos. By contrast, the non-Latino white population that represents 39% of the state's population reported 31% of recorded deaths. The Asian population represented 15% of California's population and recorded 12% of deaths due to COVID-19. And in the case of the Black population in the state, a total of 7% of recorded deaths due to COVID were among Blacks, while the share of the Black population in California is 5%. In a recent study from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, that looked at the impact of COVID-19 cases, hospitalizations, and deaths at the national level, they reached similar conclusions. This slide shows the risk of COVID-19 infection, hospitalization, and death by race and ethnicity at the national level. Each race and ethnic group is compared relative to the non-Latino white population. The results of this study showed that Latinos are 1.9 times more likely than the non-Latino white population to report a case of COVID-19, 2.8 times more likely to be hospitalized, and twice as likely than the average non-white population, non-Latino white population to die from COVID-19. These results confirm that the COVID-19 pandemic has disproportionately affected Latinos not only in California, but also in the rest of the country. These findings should take us to ask two very important questions. The first is why the COVID-19 pandemic disproportionately affected Latinos compared to other race and ethnic groups. And the second is what can be done about it. And to answer the first question, why Latinos were disproportionately affected by COVID-19, research from the UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Initiative has found that Latinos are overrepresented in lower status frontline occupations, most often linked with higher risk of COVID-19 infection. Latinos were also more likely than non-Latino whites to live in overcrowded housing that was unsuitable for proper quarantine and isolation. This overcrowded housing was also often multi-generational, meaning that individuals of multiple ages were living in the same household. The limited space available to properly quarantine and isolate in multi-generational housing often increased the risk of infection and death among vulnerable individuals. Also, the use of public transportation, a risk factor for COVID-19 infection, was also higher among Latinos compared to non-Latino whites. Latinos also had a higher prevalence of pre-existing medical conditions such as obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, renal disease, and hypertension, which increased the risk of adverse health outcomes due to COVID. And finally, discrimination, poverty, and lack of or inadequate health insurance were additional risk factors that also contributed to Latinos' increased risk during the pandemic. And lastly, but very importantly, was health insurance eligibility and access to healthcare among Latinos, which was influenced by immigration status, English language proficiency, and place of birth. So uninsured and underinsured individuals were less likely to have a regular source of healthcare and more likely to delay seeking care, which also increased the risk of adverse health consequences, including death. So for more information about this research, I encourage you to check out our full publication in the website of the UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Initiative in the link shown in this website. So before concluding, I want to propose a few answers to the second question. I asked before, what can be done about it? And very briefly, we need to work towards eliminating the health and economic inequities that Latinos face in California and in the rest of the country. To start, we need to improve access to health insurance coverage for all, including those who are undocumented. We also need to design public policies that are inclusive and that promote economic opportunity and social mobility. We also need to learn from this pandemic to avoid making the same mistakes when the next pandemic hits. To conclude, we should consider this time as a wake-up call for us to look at underlying issues behind the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 among Latinos and to reflect on what should be done to address these inequities. Thank you very much for joining us on such a special occasion. Goodbye.
Good morning. I'm Maylee Blackwell, professor and Vice Chair of the Department of Chicano and Central American Studies and I'm so happy to be here with you today to celebrate Dia de los Muertos with Rafael Solorzano, Assistant Professor of Chicano Latino Studies at Cal State LA and graduate of our department. We're here to celebrate the life and legacy of Betita Martinez. And we're going to start a little bit by showing this beautiful slideshow that Rafa created and telling a little bit about how we met Betita.
Thank you so much, Maylee, for inviting me for this special event in honor of Elizabeth Betita Martinez. I just want to share with everybody that I had the opportunity to meet Betita in the 1990s while I was a youth organizer and a student at UC Berkeley. And I just remember being in the same space and places with her, and she was a femtor to many of us back then.
Thanks, Rafa. I just got to see a picture of myself with Betita. I met Betita in 1995 with Angela Davis, who was my advisor at UC Santa Cruz in the History of Consciousness program, and they were doing a lot of work and talks on Black and Brown solidarity. I went on to be a research assistant for Betita after I finished my PhD. And 2000 to 2002, as she worked on 500 years of Chicana history and photos. Later, we went to the UN World Conference Against Racism together in 2001. And that picture was in 2005, where we celebrated the Third World Women's Alliance and its history. So we wanted to share a little bit about Betita's life and reflect on her legacy. Betita was born in 1925 to a Mexican immigrant father who was a diplomat and an Anglo mother who was a high school Spanish teacher. They lived in the segregated whites-only neighborhood that was part of the DC suburbs. She attended Swarthmore College and moved to New York, but in the era of segregation, she had to use her mother's maiden name, Sutherland, and worked under the nom de plume Elizabeth or Liz Sutherland. She worked for The Guardian, later for the United Nations, and as an editor for Simon & Schuster, and then she wrote for The Nation magazine. Anne-Marie Tedez's chapter in Chicano Movie, this gives an amazing history of this part of her life. In New York, Betita moved, when she moved to New York, she became involved with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, where she was active with the Freedom Schools in Mississippi and accompanied Stokely Carmichael to Cuba in support of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Toni Platt, her dear friend and biographer, discusses how her 1961 trip to Cuba changed her life. And her activities in Cuba eventually drew the attention of the FBI and got her subpoenaed to face the House Committee on Un-American Activities, or the House Subcommittee on Un-American Activities. She authored The Youngest Revolution, a personal report from Cuba, and her trips to Cuba shifted her work towards a lifelong commitment against anti-imperialism. She continued to work in the civil rights movement and edited the 1965 book, Letters from Mississippi. Early on, Betita was also part of women's liberation movement, consciousness raising groups, and organizing in New York, but she began to become disillusioned and grow more distant. In fact, in an oral history with me, she shared that she remembers distinctly making the decision the night that Martin Luther King was assassinated. She went to a meeting hoping to discuss the assassination and mourn collectively. And yet the white women at the meeting didn't even mention King's assassination. And that's when she knew she wasn't in the right place. But she went on to fight sexism and SNCC, and later in the Chicano movement, and many of her writings detail in her book, De Colores. As SNCC began to turn towards Black nationalism, she also struggled to find her place as a Latina within the organization, and she wrote the 1968 position paper, Black, Brown, and Tan. By then, she had been covering the farm workers' struggle when she started covering it in 1966, and particularly the Great Boycott and the Delano struggle. She joined the New Mexican land grant movement and the Tierra Amarilla struggle in the late 60s, becoming one of the editors of El Grito del Norte, the magazine that came out of New Mexico, and in 1974 publishing Viva la Raza, the struggles of Mexican American people. Her work actually is really important for teaching youth about Mexican American history. In 1976, she wrote 450 Years of Chicano History and Photos, which was reprinted as 500 Years of Chicano History and Photos and widely used in schools. In 2008, she wrote the companion volume, 500 Years of Chicana History in Photos, when she was in her 80s. For me, she's one of the most important voices of Chicana feminism. She fought the infamous statement that came out of the 1969 Denver Youth Liberation Conference, that the Chicana did not want to be liberated, which actually was a much more complicated statement about how Chicanas wanted to distance themselves from white liberation, the white women's movement. But she wrote against that position that, that would divorce women's rights from the Chicano movement. And she wrote about it across many important newspapers in the Chicano movement and the women's movement.
Thank you so much for those early years history of Betitas. I want to share a little bit about Betita's work in California. In 1976, Betita would move to California, where she would continue to discuss the need to talk about racism beyond the black and white binary. Much of Betita's organizing was about envisioning this new society and new ways, committed to developing what she would call the new raza left, which required ending inequality-based systems such as capitalism. It is in California in 1982 where Betita would run for governor under the Peace and Freedom Party. In San Francisco, she would be the co-founder of the Institute of Multiracial Justice and help launch their newsletter, Shades of Power, which documented issues of environmental racism, police brutality, violence in public schools, and workers' rights. All the articles centered and uplifted the proactive campaigns that were led by multiracial coalitions. It is in California, also in the Bay Area, specifically Oakland, that I had the opportunity to meet Betita in youth organizing spaces in the 1990s. I can fondly remember her sharing an American Indian story of the Rainbow Warriors to all of us. And we were young, we were 18, 19, some of us as young as 14 and 15. It was a vision shared by the great Oglala Sioux chief Crazy Horse that told us of a time where all the human races on Turtle Island would band together to fight against the disasters of the world. And under the symbol of the rainbow, they would spread wisdom of living in harmony with each other and with all the creatures of the world. Those who would teach this way and walk this way would be called the warriors of the rainbows. For Betita, the youth organizers of the 90s in the Bay and across the world resembled this emergence of the Rainbow Warriors. During this time, she noticed the emergence of women of color and Chicana leadership, right at the center. There were sisters at the center of youth organizing spaces. Betita built relationships with young women, with youth. She was moved by their wisdom. She was moved by their courage to walk out of their high schools. At that time, I remember having high school blowouts of 10,000 students, as big as the East LA blowouts of 1968. She remembers the courage of the young Chicanas who led the hunger strikes for Chicano studies at UCLA, and also the youth who walked out against the anti-immigrant policies and the rise of the prison industrial complex. Within these spaces, she would mentor youth of color and assist with developing multiracial youth-led organizations across the Bay Area and California. While traveling across the state, she was most impressed by their proactive strategies within youth organizing. She would be a key femtor to youth organizing spaces like Inner City Struggle of the East Side, Youth Together from Oakland, Storm from the Bay Area, Chicana Moratorium, and their youth arm VOS in Oakland, just to name a few.
This is amazing to remember her powerful life. But I think in this time, in this context, it's also important for us to call forward Betita's legacy. So I want to center how she fought for feminism in the midst of anti-capitalist, racial justice, and anti-globalization movements. Her solidarity across borders against war in her Raza contra Guerra organizing. How she centered migrant voices fighting against anti-imperialism, which is so important as the US is now trying to end its longest war, the war on terror. She centered people of color and multi-racial justice organizing and multi-generational organizing.
Thank you, Meili. I want to call for so many things as well, because I feel the next generations need to learn about Betita. I want to call forward her vision that we could build other systems, other worlds, that we have the capacity to enact otros mundos. Otros mundos sí son posibles. I also want to call forward this desire of a movement culture that honors mutual respect between all people, a culture that is not riddled with contradictions between the ideal and actual conduct, the desire to create a movement that does not center individualism or egoism. I also want to call forward this commitment to our youth, this commitment to empower them in our university spaces and in our community to continue to build the rainbow warriors of the present and the future.
Thank you, Rafa. Betita, presente.
Presente.
Betita,
Presente.
Betita.
Presente.
Hello, my name is Karina Alma. I am an assistant professor in the Chicano and Central American Studies Department at UCLA. Chicano, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Central American cultures and communities flourish through our cultural memory, and especially in the visuals created by Latinx artists for our social movements, our cultures, and diverse histories.
These critical and inspirational images represent a small sample of student artwork and altares, meaning Day of the Dead altars, that our diverse student body create in Intro to Chicano and Chicana culture and history, where they learn about the diverse histories within Mexican American and Latinx community formations. One of those artists vital to the development of knowledge and whose work defined Chicano culture as a Chicana artist and activist was Yolanda Lopez. She passed this year, and though her death is unrelated to COVID-19, we remember her. And her iconic work intended to empower Chicanx communities like Who's the Illegal Alien Pilgrim? That demanded immigrant, farm worker, and environmental rights and social change, not in the near future, but today. Her work helped to raise our social consciousness, especially gender consciousness, that drew from her own family, to redefine the meaning of the Virgin of Guadalupe and her embodiment within our own relatives. Shown in another iconic piece, portrait of the artist as the Virgin of Guadalupe. And like the Virgin of Guadalupe, women's dignity and value cannot be defined by the length of her skirt, nor her gender consciousness on whether or not she wears high heels. We remember Yolanda Lopez and her Chicana and Latina contribution to the world. For to honor and empower the living, we must first honor our dead. With this loss and love in mind, I introduce you to poet, spoken word artist, and UCLA graduate, Elisa Griego.
For how do I be disgustingly truthful for a lens when I ran for a year from the burning I buried 6 feet deep? A velvet war of bruises, burdens, of an empty chair that used to warm your body. It unraveled. Yes, I have loved and lost. And in this war, no one was left untouched, for our community has housed a legacy of despair, and I've desperately scattered through the air for faith, inflicted by generations that use our limbs as test sites, Silesian heights where chemicals were poured on women and children. For what's a brown and black body? It is impossible to cast out your light when you remember who you are. I am enlightened from the scars of my ancestors. I am a human being, and that is enough to be seen by the judge who slides the scale, for these scales are disheartening, and the numbers are counting more and more Latinos and African Americans perishing. They said these jails have the person and the family sentenced to indentured servitude until the stones are collected, turning to roses, and love is projected to every person who is living instead of surviving, crying in the absence of someone they love. She passed on a Monday. The darkness crept across my chest. The burning never stopped. For how can I stop loving you? I fell in love with her. Now I'm burying the both of you. 6 feet, stay in control. 6 feet, not everyone can go to the funeral. Sitting in my car as they lowered your casket, there's agony raging in my soul. Chaos painted a masquerade. But I'm breaking loose, and I hope you can too, as I feel the fury of death, the misery of dissipated trust, and the closeness that was once us. I ended up with no faith, kneeling for vanished souls and new beginnings. So who will bring peace to the cities, and who will bring peace to the deceased? The city is saying it's okay to lay you and everyone we lost to, the gods and goddesses of Mother Earth, sky, water, fire, ancestors. I'll let go. I'm letting go.
For now and evermore, that's all. That's all.
Hi everyone, my name is Joshua Guzman and I am professor here in the Department of Gender Studies at UCLA. I want to thank you all for watching this wonderful event. I have the great honor of following Alyssa Griego's wonderful performance. And that poem really struck me, in particular these 3 lines that I would just like to reiterate for us. Until the stones are collected, turning to roses, and love is projected to every person. Those lines really hit me because, well, you see, I lost my grandma at the beginning of the pandemic. And in losing her, it made me realize that with loss, there's always some form of love lingering around. You see, I didn't get to say goodbye to her. She was in Texas, and obviously I was here in Los Angeles. Couldn't travel, there was a lockdown. I felt very distant from her. So when she passed, there were lots of days of crying and just trying to remember her, listening to those voice messages of happy birthdays that I've saved, and things like that, just to hear her voice. And knowing that in crying, in remembering that all of that was really the release of love. In other words, that loss is the release of love. And so a lesson that my grandma's passing has taught me is that you can't really think about loss and love without each other. And so what's also very important is, a grandma or a mother will always say this, you have to, answer my call while I'm still calling. And you don't really understand that at the moment, because the great thing about mothers is that they always call at the wrong time. But what my grandma's passing actually revealed was that in the release of love, one actually has to take an account of those who are still here with us too. So if we're remembering people who are no longer here and releasing that love for them, it is also a reminder that we have love for one another who are still here. And so that is something that I keep on returning to, especially as this pandemic is still with us and we still continue to suffer the deaths of so many people in our community, that we should cherish those who are still here, that we should be kinder and showing love to those who are still with us. And so in remembering those who have passed, it is also an act of sharing love for those who are still with us here. But as we keep on fighting for more just worlds and causes, we carry those we've lost with us in these battles and in these marches. And so when we think about the relationship between love and loss, we're thinking about how we're always carrying our past with us, even though they may not be present the lesson is to always release and project, as Alyssa reminds us, that love out into the world that we are still so lucky to be part of. And I'm so very lucky to be part of this community and to be sharing this program with you. And I just want to offer lots of love to those of you during these times. Thank you. A lot of us have lost so many people to the pandemic. So allow us to take a moment of silence to remember those who have passed.
We are now near the conclusion of today's event. I want to encourage us to honor our loved ones by working towards a society where all have the opportunity to thrive. This means that we must collectively tackle the extreme economic inequalities that are too often exacerbated by racism and a broken immigration system. Like Professors Blackwell and Solórzano, I also want to honor the vision of Betita Martinez, who believed in multiracial solidarity as we fight for a more just world. This also means that those of us who are privileged will really need to think hard about how we can extend our privileges to others more broadly. My hope is that the current pandemic provides us with many lessons on how we might move forward to fight for social change in a way that allows all of us, especially our most vulnerable community members, to lead healthy lives and live with dignity and pride. We are now going to close our event with the final performance by Juan Francisco Cristobal, UCLA graduate student.
yatahion ay koa Tutol chok chok al jagko nabal Mimeng wal shut hungko pishandi Yapaniki sonekto Ay shin chuchik jamin Shewalonito ay ile herkan tekeba